Winter in Wisconsin felt unreal to the Japanese prisoners of war. They had expected heat, humidity, something familiar. Instead, there was snow piled higher than fences, frozen wind cutting through thin uniforms, and silence that felt heavier than chains. The camp itself was quiet that morning. No shouting, no alarms, just guards moving calmly between barracks. Then, something strange happened. Instead of the usual meals, dark bread, soup, unfamiliar foods, the prisoners were ordered to line up for breakfast. Metal trays were handed out as always, but when the lids were lifted, several men froze. White rice, perfectly steamed, plain, clean, no sauce, no meat, no explanation. For many of the prisoners, rice wasn't just food. It was memory. It was home. It was ceremony. And in war, it was also something else. Several men stiffened. One older prisoner quietly lowered his head. Another whispered something urgently to the man beside him. They had seen this before. In their culture, a simple bowl of white rice was sometimes served before death, a final act of dignity, a last taste of home. The line slowed as prisoners hesitated to eat. Some pushed the tray away. Others stared at the steam rising from the rice, convinced this was not kindness, but a signal. Across the mess hall, an American guard noticed the reaction. He frowned. This was not how prisoners usually responded to better food. And for the first time since arriving in Wisconsin, the guards realized something was very wrong. They thought the meal meant the end. The rice sat untouched. Minutes passed, but almost no one ate. An American sergeant finally noticed the problem. From his point of view, this was a small improvement, something warm, simple, and filling. Yet the mess hall felt heavier with every second. Conversations had stopped. Even the usual clatter of trays was gone. He signaled for the camp interpreter. The interpreter was a young American-born Japanese man. When he stepped inside, he immediately sensed the tension. Faces were pale, hands were clenched. Some prisoners avoided looking at the food entirely. He spoke softly, asking why no one was eating. At first, there was silence. Then, an older prisoner answered, his voice calm but resigned. He explained that in their culture, white rice served alone was not just a meal. It was often symbolic, a sign of finality, a gesture given before the end. The interpreter froze. He turned toward the guards and explained everything quickly. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The sergeant's face changed. Not anger, not suspicion, but shock. He had no idea. None of them did. What they thought was a small act of respect had been understood as a final message. Immediately, the guards reacted. Extra food was brought in, vegetables, bread, soup. The interpreter raised his voice so everyone could hear. "This is not the end," he said clearly. "This meal means nothing like that. You are not being punished. You are not being judged." Slowly, shoulders relaxed. One man finally lifted his chopsticks. Another followed. Then another. The rice was eaten, not as a farewell, but as food. And something unseen shifted inside the camp. Not trust, not friendship, but understanding. After that morning, things in the camp began to change. Quietly, almost invisibly. There were no announcements, no speeches, no official apologies. But the guards paid closer attention. Meals were adjusted. Foods were explained in advance. When something unfamiliar appeared on a tray, the interpreter made sure the prisoners understood what it meant, and just as importantly, what it didn't mean. The rice incident spread through the camp like a whisper. Men who had barely spoken since arriving began to talk again, not loudly, not with joy, but with a sense of relief that had been missing since they crossed the ocean. For the prisoners, the shock was not just the misunderstanding. It was the realization that the guards had listened. In war, listening was rare. One prisoner later said that moment mattered more than the food itself. The rice had reminded them of home, but the explanation reminded them they were still alive, still seen as human beings, not symbols. Winter dragged on. Snowstorms buried the fences. Wisconsin remained cold and unforgiving. But inside the camp, tension eased. Guards noticed fewer arguments, fewer withdrawn faces, more quiet cooperation. The prisoners noticed something else. Small gestures. A pause before orders, a nod, an explanation instead of silence. No one pretended the camp was easy. It wasn't. But after the bowl of white rice, fear no longer ruled every meal, and that, for men far from home, meant more than anyone expected. Years later, many of the men who had been held in Wisconsin struggled to describe what that bowl of white rice truly represented. It was not mercy. It was not forgiveness. And it was certainly not freedom. It was something smaller and rarer. It was proof that misunderstanding did not have to end in cruelty. After the war, several former prisoners spoke about their time in the camp. They rarely mentioned fences or guards. Instead, they spoke about moments, brief, fragile moments, when fear loosened its grip. The rice incident was always one of them. In a world defined by orders, uniforms, and distance, someone had stopped and listened. Someone had realized that meaning could be lost between cultures and that silence could be more dangerous than words. The guards never intended harm. The prisoners never intended defiance. Between them stood a simple bowl of food, and a mistake that could have deepened fear, but instead created understanding. When spring finally reached Wisconsin and the snow melted away, the camp looked the same from the outside, but inside, something had changed. Meals were no longer faced with dread. Explanations replaced assumptions. And the men learned that even in captivity, dignity could survive, sometimes in the quietest ways. The white rice was never served alone again, and long after the war ended, that decision remained one small reminder that humanity could exist, even when the world was breaking apart. Years later, many of the men who had been held in Wisconsin struggled to describe what that bowl of white rice truly represented. It was not mercy. It was not forgiveness. And it was certainly not freedom. It was something smaller and rarer. It was proof that misunderstanding did not have to end in cruelty. After the war, several former prisoners spoke about their time in the camp. They rarely mentioned fences or guards. Instead, they spoke about moments, brief, fragile moments, when fear loosened its grip. The rice incident was always one of them. In a world defined by orders, uniforms, and distance, someone had stopped and listened. Someone had realized that meaning could be lost between cultures, and that silence could be more dangerous than words. The guards never intended harm. The prisoners never intended defiance.